Assalamualaikum. Selamat Hari Raya, Salam Aidilfitri. Anda sedang menonton Agenda Awani. Dan sebenarnya dengan suasana Aidilfitri, saya ingin membincangkan tentang agama Islam sebenarnya. Tetapi sejak 9/11 ataupun 9/11, pelbagai perkara disebut tentang Muslim dan Islam itu sendiri. Dan di hari yang mulia ini mungkin bagus untuk kita mendapatkan pandangan seorang Muslim yang berada dalam komuniti yang majoritinya bukan Muslim, tetapi berbicara tentang Islam, tentang isu sejagat seperti gender dan sebagainya. Oleh itu, izinkan saya untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggeris. I would like to introduce to you a very, very special guest today. You know, when you go and Google things on the internet, I do that all the time nowadays. And then I was you put a smile to my face because I saw this phrase, the Brangelina of Oz. One half of that Brangelina of Oz is here. Susan Cullen, thank you so much
for
being here. I mean, you wear so many hats apart from Brangelina because you do serious stuff. You know, you attached to university, you're a researcher, you're a lecturer. You're still doing your PhD.
Yes.
And
yes.
Your thesis was about Muslim women and access to the mosque, for example. I mean, even in Malaysia, I don't think I've come across anybody doing those kind of research. So that's why I'm going to come in, because you gave a talk at the embassy, and a lot of my colleagues who were there said, well, you know, basically she's saying that you're free to read up and to chat about being a Muslim. And I think you became a Muslim at the age of 19. But before I go on and on, because there's so much to talk about, and there's so little time always on this show with great people, I would just like to say and go to the point that it has not been easy, even for Muslim in the majority Muslim nation post 9/11. And we've got to adapt, especially when we go out of our comfort zone geographically. But how has it been for you? Because all the articles that I've read will have words like bringing down the social barricades, creative way of being a Muslim, explaining about Islam. So I guess 13 years, 10 years after, more than 10 years after, it has come to a new level where we must not only tackle it head on, but be proactive in being who we are. So I want to open up with that huge mother statement, because I know I can keep quiet now and you can fill out the rest.
Yeah, it has been a fascinating challenge in Australia, being a Muslim, and especially being a Muslim woman who is visibly Muslim, because there are so many misconceptions about what it means to be a Muslim and a Muslim woman in Australia. And I realised very quickly I could either be frustrated by the situation or I could try to change it and be part of a constructive conversation. So really not long after I became Muslim, I became involved in, you know, many different projects to try to change the way people understood what it meant to be a Muslim. There's so few Muslims in Australia, really. There's less than 500,000 of us in a country of 23 million. So many people in Australia have never even spoken to a Muslim before. There hasn't been any of that one-on-one human interaction. So I really wanted to participate in things that could bring the idea of what it meant to be a Muslim and a Muslim woman to the widest possible Australian audience. In interesting ways. You know, it can't just be giving a lecture in a town hall. People don't want to come to that in Australia. So I participate in things like fashion exhibitions at museums and a TV show, a comedy TV show by Muslims in Australia, because I really feel that those are the ways that we can really break down a lot of barriers and start to see each other as human beings as opposed to just the caricatures that we see in the media.
If you look at it, sometimes it's always easier to do things where there are no set ways or perceived set ways. So maybe a lot of people tend to look at minority Muslim communities and think that they are disadvantaged. But a lot of proactive people will also see that as an advantage because you hunger for more things and you tend to prove yourself out more and work harder in that sense. Is that true for the Sila?
Absolutely, I think so. And especially because we are a relatively small community, there's not a lot of rules about how we present ourselves. We're still finding our way as a Muslim community in Australia, so we can really create a lot. It's not like, well, this is how it's always been done, so this is how we have to keep doing it. We can make our own way, which means there's a really interesting sort of organic Australian Islam that's starting to develop in Australia, which is really exciting and really great to be a part of.
Geographically, it does make sense for the Australian government and other institutions in Australia to look at Islam closely because, I mean, just up north, you know, the populous Muslim nations of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei put together, for example. So how does that work for what you're doing right now? Because I'm sure there's a lot more interest about the Muslim community and maybe neighbours, not just because we are Muslim in Southeast Asia, but that's the logical next area to grow with.
Absolutely, and especially, you know, we live in a global world now where, you know, those old geographical barriers are really being broken down. We're all each other's neighbours, but especially, like you said, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei, they're so close to Australia that in fact Muslims from Makassar came to Australia before white settlement. So Muslims actually predate white people in Australia. There's this long history that a lot of people don't know about, even a lot of Australians aren't aware of. So, you know, it's really an exciting time for us to see a great opportunity for exchange between the countries and learning from each other and really taking, I think we can learn a lot from Malaysia and Indonesia about the way you guys do Islam and what it means to be Muslim in these countries. We can learn a lot from that.
Talking about Islam generally, the community around the world, a lot of thinkers long for the great philosophers of the old times, and because those were the days where if you're a great subject matter expert in science and medicine, for example, but you're also a great philosopher at the same time. So I guess the intellectual tradition of Islam, hearing what you say right now in Australia, is moving well.
I hope so. I would like it to be. And as you say, the intellectual tradition in Islam is such a great ocean. You know, it's so wide and it's so deep. And we did used to have these amazing polymaths, people who were experts in so many different fields. It was just the norm. And I feel, unfortunately, a lot of the Muslim community and the ummah around the world, we've lost touch with that tradition. And I think we're not aware of just how rich it was, how diverse it was. So if we can start to develop that further, especially in Australia, it would be brilliant to see.
I have to go for the first break, but once we are back, maybe that's the face of Islam that would make that bridge first to the non-Muslim community, especially the Western ones, because that's what they can identify with, because knowledge transcends all boundaries. So instead of looking at the colors of the skin or the religion that we profess, you know, you look what you have in common. Like if it's a research team, then it's a research team, you know. It doesn't have to be Muslim, non-Muslim. So I would like to tap into your expertise, not ask you hard questions, but I guess people will come up and have come up to you and say, oh, you're a Muslim, so what do you think of 9/11? And what do you think of Israel and Palestine issue, for example? So let's take a leaf out of that, because you have to face real situations. And I guess having a new creative way of answering and of explaining helps and goes a long way. That we'll discuss after this break. I started by saying the phrase Brangelina Voss, but actually, you know, even if I look at all the other tribute that has been given to you and your husband, like the future Muslim leaders and stuff like that. So I think it's very powerful what you have done and your husband has done, together and separately. Both of you are in the media, and there's even an article explaining how your style and your husband's style, Walid Ali, is they are different, but they are along the strong tradition of Islam in the sense. So I've never seen such write-up about idols in my own country. I guess being out there, as in the media, and becoming role models for not only Muslims but for non-Muslims as well, because the issues that you profess are not just by the colors of the face that you have, but these are real issues. Before I go to the Middle East or West Asia side of the issue being talked about, let's talk about gender empowerment, for example. And I'm sure you will get that a lot too, because wearing what you wear and being who you are, the color of your skin, and having Islam as your religion is both an advantage and disadvantage perception-wise when people come up to you.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that is probably one of the greatest misunderstandings about Muslims, is that Muslim women are just this oppressed block of people en masse, and that Islam is very
even
bad.
in Australia, there's still that perception.
Because you've got to understand, like I said, most Australians have probably never spoken to a Muslim before, and so the only source of information they get about Muslims is what they see in the media happening overseas.
And the
terrible, the internet, the terrible things they see happening, especially to women in certain countries that are Muslim majority, and so they think, well, that must be Islam, that honour killings must be acceptable by Islam.
So you wouldn't
for
be able to drive a car.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's when that's all they get. On one level, it's understandable that they think that if no alternative information is being given to them. So it's really something I'm very passionate about, is trying to ensure that an alternative story is out there, and an alternative understanding of the reality for Muslim women, what our religious tradition teaches about women, but also just the everyday experiences of Muslim women, especially in Australia, because so often Muslim women are talked about, but they're not actually given the opportunity to speak for themselves. You know, the conversation goes on around them about them, but they're never invited to contribute. And so I really want to, you know, help push Muslim women's voices to the fore.
A lot of gender empowerment issues center around, you know, hotly contested issue by some quarters, like, you know, females can lead, but there's a but, you know. So, but if we look at it, there's movement in the corporate sector for a percentage of the board members to be from the female side, for example. So how do you look at that? Because some are saying that there shouldn't be any quota, they shouldn't be treated differently, because it doesn't matter whether the man or woman, but it's the ability that matters. It's the thinking, it's the communication skills, for example. So how do you look at that? Because it can be a double-edged sword. If you represent a gender struggle and the face of gender struggle from the Islamic community, then you might be just stereotyped to that, and they don't see you for who you are.
Yeah, very true. And you can just be seen as a troublemaking woman who's trying to change the religion, which is such a frustrating argument, because, you know, all we need to do is really look at what does our religion really teach. We don't need to come up with, you know, crazy new modern interpretations. The classical interpretations and understandings of Islam have a wealth of empowerment for women. And when it comes to things like saying, well, we shouldn't have to have quotas, it should just be whoever's best for the job, I agree with that in theory. It should be who's best for the job. The problem is, though, if you have boards that are always full of men or a certain group of people, it's very difficult for new types of people to break in unless you have those quotas, because people get into the standard mindset and they don't see other people. So it can be that women are the most qualified, but for whatever reason, people still have the mindset that they want to keep employing men. So sometimes, at least in the beginning, we need to have quotas to level the playing field, because assuming that everyone is going to be chosen on ability assumes that it is a level playing field, and often it's not. So just in the beginning, we sometimes need that. Maybe
we have to do that in practice first. Maybe that's why the thesis was focusing on women and the access to mosques, for example.
Maybe, I don't know. I think it's always good to talk about the theories of gender empowerment, but in the end I'm interested in the practicality of what happens on the ground. And we can talk to a blue in the face about wonderful theories and wonderful rulings, but if it's not being translated into justice for everybody.
Did you find anything surprising in your thesis when you were doing the research?
One of the loveliest things, I think, was that the vast majority of the women that I interviewed, in fact all except one, said, I want to use Islam to improve the situation for women. They weren't saying Islam's the problem, we need to get rid of Islam so we can have women's empowerment. What they said, Islam is the tool. Our religion is the prism that we will get empowerment for women.
Okay.
And I think that is would be very surprising for a lot of non-Muslims. I don't think that they would expect that that is the attitude of all these passionate Muslim women saying, our religion isn't the problem, we need to use it to change things.
Okay. Like it or not, there are stigmas and labels, and because it's such a global village, what happened in Gaza will also be reverberating in Australia or Malaysia or anywhere else around the world. So how do you bring this discourse globally? Because you have traveled quite a lot and you have been speaking on certain issues regarding this. So how do you bring this discourse forward? Because I'm sure even between the Brangelina of Oz, Muslim Brangelina of Oz, there'll be, you know, hard discussions maybe between you and your husband about certain things. But to do it in front of a large global audience, sometimes you can't cover many sides as much as you would want to, and you do have to take a stand and you do have to give out certain opinions. So how do you do that? Because that in itself sometimes can carry whiplash
Absolutely.
effect. So let's discuss that, because I like this part where they say that this is a new creative interpretation of talking about Islam. So maybe we can take a leaf out of that from you to share even for our country Malaysia right after this break. How do you fight sexism? Not by arguing against it, by doing research and proving that, you know, it's not a hindrance to be a female in Islam, for example. But we'll come to that a bit later. I guess the biggest label that we have to look at is the perception people make from everyday news. And it's sad and tragic, but we want to talk about Gaza in a good way. Too many times, social media included more and more nowadays. You know, as they were preparing for sahur, for example, you know, they'll be tweeting more about what type of bombs are coming down rather than what kind of food that they're having. So I haven't seen that. In Malaysia, people like to put on Instagram what they're having for the break of fast, what they're having for, but from Gaza, all we're seeing about war and battles, for example. So when you speak in any international forum, for example, or congregation of people, so this will be the stark reality that you have to put into and balance out with. But it's not easy, because once you take one side, then there'll be the other side response. So how do you creatively, because that's what you do in Australia, you know, on your own TV show, radio, or whatever else. So how do you bring this to the international forum? Because I'm sure you've faced resistance before.
It can be difficult. I think the most important thing as a Muslim in Australia talking about international issues, and especially when there are international issues of injustice, is that it's really important that we look like we are fair across the board. So it's no good for us to be angry and upset about what's happening in Gaza if we're not equally upset about injustices that Muslims cause around the world, because otherwise we look hypocritical. If we're really interested in justice and mercy for people who are suffering, it needs to be that we are interested in that for everybody, and that includes if Muslims are doing the wrong thing too. We need to be concerned with innocent victims everywhere, because otherwise, you know, understand, fair enough, the non-Muslim community can say, you're not really interested in justice, you only care when you are the victims. And we need to be, as Muslims, I really believe we need to have a concern for all of humanity that is suffering. So it's really important that we look fair in our public discussions.
So one being in the media, I wish I have your background. There was this article that sort of put it in a way that eat your heart out after reading this article, because it's so tough. You are half of the couple that are said to be the most wanted couple at the dinner table, for example. So because you can be articulate, you can be intelligent, you can be funny and humorous too. But moving forward, I guess being an academic, it does help because you do have facts to back you up. And looking at reality, not just from theoretical perspective, but also the practical side of it, imbued with the values that we learn from Al-Quran and the Sunnah, for example. I guess this is a new way of living it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important because otherwise everything we say is just opinion. We need to have facts to back up what we're saying in every area, whether it be about women's rights and the experiences of Muslim women, or Islamophobia, or any other area. We need to be able to say, well, what's really happening here? Because unless we have facts, it's just, theory and conjecture and conversation. But once we have facts, then it's much easier to work out, okay, so if we have a problem here, how do we address that?
So if we take the example of your PhD thesis that you're currently working on, how does it work in that sense?
I think in terms of the facts, if I look at it the way that I present it to both a Muslim audience and a non-Muslim audience, it's about showing that to a non-Muslim audience, as I said, that Muslim women are actually very happy to be Muslim. They feel there's a lot of empowerment in the religion. Here is the data that backs. These are the many women I spoke to in Australia and overseas that present this. But it's also good to show, in terms of data to a non-Muslim audience. For example, when I did a research thesis on Muslim women's access to the mosque in Australia, there were some really sad statistics about women not being allowed into any of the masajid, or not being able to find the way in, being excluded, because that's useful data, because then we can take it to the masjid and say, this is the experience of half of our community, and really more than half our community, because where women go, children go. And if women don't feel that they can go to the mosque, then they're not bringing their children either. So we have this hard data. How can we now improve the situation in light of Quran and Sunnah and the way the masjid should be for everybody? What can we do with this information now? It gets beyond just people complaining or having an idea, and now we have information that we can work with.
You make me want to go to Australia tomorrow.
Come
I've never
over.
been there. I've never been there. But before we close, before we close, how do you celebrate the Eid al-Fitr there, for example? What is a typical scene and scenario?
A typical scene is that my children wake up ridiculously early because they're so excited, 3 a.m. And we get dressed in our best clothes. We go to the Eid prayer. The Muslim community in Australia is very multicultural. We come from more than 60 cultural backgrounds. So our Eid prayer is like the United Nations. There's everybody's from everywhere.
It doesn't sound that different from here.
Yes, lots of food and presents.
I guess you will have one day to celebrate Eid al-Fitr here.
Yeah.
Then we could truly. This is your second home, right?
It is. It is.
Thank you so much, Susan Cullen, for
Thank
making
you for
time.
having me. Thank you.
Please Google Susan Cullen and Walid Ali, and you have Brangelina, right, together with their names. So, but we have to evolve and we have to find new ways. And I guess what we have been discussing for the last half hour was about that. Terima kasih banyak kepada anda. Hantarkan pandangan anda sendiri kepada pelbagai platform yang Astro Awani ada, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, ataupun muat turun aplikasi Mudah Alih di gadget Mudah Alih anda. Dan insyaAllah kita akan jumpa dalam episod Agenda Awani yang lain pula. Sekian, selamat malam, salam Aidilfitri, maaf zahir batin. Jumpa lagi.